So I'd like to welcome everyone tonight and say good evening. My name is Hope Saska, and I am Chief Curator and Director of Academic Engagement at the CU Art Museum, University of Colorado Boulder. I am pleased to welcome you to our museum's remote program for this evening, and I am delighted to introduce our speaker, Susan Tallman. Susan is an art historian, an essayist, and art critic whose contributions to the literature on contemporary art, especially printmaking, are numerous. And she really is a print evangelist. And you may read her articles and essays and publications such as the New York Review of Books, The Atlantic, and in many others. Susan has co-authored and authored many books and museum catalogues dedicated to printmaking in North America, with recent publications on Jim Dine and Alison Saar, as well as a museum catalog for the British Museum on American printmaking from pop to the present. Most recently, Susan has co-authored No Plan at All, How the Danish Printshop of Niels Borch Jensen redefined artist prints for the contemporary world. Susan's talk this evening is entitled In, Not on the Paper, Sharks Ink. And our talk coincides with the CU Art Museum's exhibition celebrating Sharks Ink, which is a publisher of contemporary prints run by master printer Bud Shark and his team in Lyons, Colorado. The exhibition at the CU Art Museum is called Onward and Upward, Sharks Ink, and it will be on view through July 15th of 2023. So if you're in the Colorado area, we really hope that you come and visit us. We will save questions for the end of the talk. However, you may use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen to log your questions at any time. My colleague, Elizabeth Vandermark Gregg, will be assisting me in moderating, and we will also be following the chat for comments and questions. Please join me in welcoming Susan.
Okay, thank you, Hope. Am I audible here? All good? Okay, terrific. I'm, of course, delighted to be here, if only virtually, to talk about Sharks Ink and Bud Shark and how all of that figures in contemporary art. The one thing I have to begin with an apology, which is doing these things virtually, you can't see the audience and you don't know who's in it, which means that you can guess really wrongly about how much knowledge of a situation the audience is bringing to bear. So if either I tell you things that you're painfully familiar with, or I glide over things that you would like to know more about, accept my apologies. I hope you all have cocktails and mocktails at hand to help you through any glitches that occur. But what I wanted to do tonight was talk a little bit about Sharks Ink and Bud Shark in terms of the art historical and general context in which the workshop arose and how it relates to other art going on at the time. So the Venice Biennale may seem like an odd place to begin a talk about a master printer based in Colorado, but in a real sense, this is where Bud's career began. And the story behind that tells us some important things about the ethos of collaborative printmaking and about the abilities and values that would come to characterize Sharks Ink. And I only discovered this story a few years back when I was asked to do a presentation for a foundation in France about the American contribution to the 1970 Venice Biennale. And I'd read about that Biennale. It was kind of famous as a train wreck. And it was one where the United States had rejected the usual art star, let's win some prizes with paintings and sculpture routine in favor of an all printmaking pavilion. It was the one that Ed Ruscha created his famous room of screen printed chocolate, much to the delight of audience and insects. But I didn't know anyone who'd actually been there. And then somebody told me I should talk to Bud. I had known Bud at that point for years, but being the hyperbolically modest, soft-spoken person that he had never bothered to mention this. This is Bud standing next to a poster for his exhibition at the United States Pavilion. So, how does a 24-year-old kid from North Dakota who has never been out of the country before end up showing in the world's most important art exhibition? According to Bud, it started a few years earlier when he was home in Fargo on break from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and saw a kind of perplexing picture in a local gallery. It was an image that to him looked like the ink was in rather than on the paper, and he couldn't figure it out. He asked about it and was told it was a lithograph. So when he got back to Madison, he sought out the art department's print shop and began to study lithography. From Madison, he went to the University of New Mexico for grad school, where he met his wife, Barbara. And from New Mexico, he went to Tamarind Lithography Workshop in Los Angeles to burnish his bona fides as a master printer of artists' lithographs. Now, this is a somewhat curious anomaly. Generally speaking, universities are where you go to study arts and sciences, not manual skills. And for most of history, being a printer was an artisanal trade, not an art form. Bud had trained as an artist. That's his work that he's showing in Venice, but also as a printer for other people. Timing is everything. If Bud had encountered that lithograph in Fargo in 1956 instead of 1966, the story would have been different. Because in 1956, as Brooklyn Museum curator Una Johnson noted, today in the United States, some of the most original and creative statements in the field of art are to be found in the medium of fine printmaking. Enhancement of color, of texture, flowing line, and daring combinations of print methods have been of especial consequence in the woodcut, engraving, and etching. She did not mention lithography, though she pointed with pride to the fact that in America, the majority of prints are printed by the artist himself and not by a professional craftsman printer, as is so often the case in Europe. That was a kind of demure slag at the supremely skillful French lithography workshops, where painters could go to make their prints, or, more problematically, to have their prints made for them. In Europe, there was a not very clearly marked slippery slope between a print made by an artist drawing directly on a stone and one made by an artist handing off a drawing to a technician who would recreate it on the stone. Americans were having none of it, but then again, we didn't need to, since American printmakers were busy with etching and woodcut, and American painters, newly prominent on the global art stage in the 50s, weren't interested anyway. Franz Klein, whose paintings were included in the 56 Biennale, said, "Printmaking concerns social attitudes, printing, multiplying, educating. I can't think about it. I'm involved with the private image." Larry Rivers thought of printmaking as the dull occupation of pipe-smoking corduroy artisans. And for Robert Motherwell, printmaking just wasn't a natural, logical, or convenient point of attack for what we were involved in. Then again, none of those painters had much experience of lithography, which is the most natural print medium for painters, since you can use brushes and pencils rather than things like knives and needles. They had no experience of lithography because lithography was all but dead in the US. So when an American artist named June Wayne found she had to go to France to make lithographs, she set about fixing the situation and founded Tamarind Lithography Workshop in 1960 with the aim of igniting a new era for American lithography. Bizarrely, it actually worked. Tamarind's founders recognized the problem as a systemic one, so they set about educating absolutely everybody. They set up a program for training master printers who they hoped would take the gospel of lithography out into the world and establish workshops, attract artists, and produce a market. They invited artists for residency so they could actually find out what the medium had to offer. They would even help you store all those prints that were going to be made. And they would celebrate rather than hide the contributions of the collaborating printers. In addition to the artist signature and the edition number, every print would carry an embossed symbol identifying the printer. It's a small thing, but it's significant because the reality is that good printers don't simply execute artists' instructions. They offer insight, opportunities, possibilities, suggestions. In myriad ways, they help shape the art. Around the same time, on America's other coast, Tatjana Grossman established Universal Limited Art Editions, ULAE, in her living room and then moved to her garage with a small secondhand litho press and the assistance of artist Robert Blackburn, who had trained as a lithographer in the WPA. Together, Tamarind and ULAE would spearhead what became known as the American Print Renaissance. One important thing is that neither of these women had any experience as printers or workshop managers or art dealers. Before founding Tamarind, Wayne had been an artist. Before founding ULAE, Grossman had been an artist's wife. They were making it all up from scratch, and so were the artists. In the 50s, art critic Harold Rosenberg had drawn a distinction between the orderly, principle-driven trajectory he saw in European art and the kind of freewheeling pragmatism he considered intrinsically American. Using the American Revolution for his metaphor, he dubbed the former redcoats and the latter coonskins. The new American print shops were pure coonskin. The artist's ignorance of how a print was supposed to be made was a prompt for the printers to figure out how it could be made. They lacked the technical skills of European printers, but they were flexible and adventurous and imaginative and very disinclined to ever say no. The story of Robert Rauschenberg's lithograph accident became a kind of parable for this ethos. Rauschenberg had been working on a large stone at ULAE and it broke in the press. He recreated the composition on another stone, which also broke in the press. At that point, he decided to print from the pieces, collaborating, as it were, with the disaster. Accident became the first American print to take first prize at the Ljubljana Graphic Biennial, a big enough deal at the time to prompt a special press release from the Museum of Modern Art. It wasn't until the next year that he took the top prize at the Venice Biennale. So, you needed a new kind of printer, but you also needed Rauschenberg and Johns and Hockney and all the other artists who suddenly saw printmaking as relevant and intriguing. Things that had been detractions became attractions. Prints connected, in a way painting often did not do, to the real world of objects, social systems, mass production, and the built environment. They offered a place for examining how images and text are transformed into experiences and ideas. They offered a place for investigating the territory between the found and the made, between intent and indirection, and, as importantly, a place inevitably full of accidents. What the master printer had to offer, New York Times critic John Russell wrote, was not printmaking in the old sense. It was printmaking as metamorphosis, and it was irresistible. Timing, again, is everything. In 1969, when the Museum of Modern Art dedicated an exhibition entirely to Tamarind, Bud Shark was in the process of finishing his degree and looking for teaching jobs. But the British painter Bernard Cohen, whom he'd met in New Mexico, suggested that he might instead move to London to work as a collaborating printer for Editions Electo, which had become a key player in British pop art. Bud agreed, but first he went to Venice. The 1970 Biennale was wrong-footed from the start. In 1968, predictably, there had been large-scale protests against what was called a fascist capitalist commercial art show. Jurors resigned, artists withdrew, 1,200 police had to be called into the grounds of the Biennale. Searching for a way to diffuse incipient anti-Americanism, the US planners hit upon the idea of printmaking, an art form whose American exemplars were now being celebrated across the globe for openness, experimentation, and collaboration across borders. The plan had the pavilion exhibiting a wide range of important American prints from Anaskevich to Warhol, and at the same time, being a site of live collaboration. An exterior wall of the pavilion was replaced with glass so visitors could watch art being made in real time by international artists working with American artist teachers. One of those artist teachers was one of Bud's professors from Madison, and he asked Bud to come and help out. Everything went wrong. When American forces invaded Cambodia, most of the artists withdrew. Workshop equipment and supplies were stolen or broken or impounded by Italian customs. The glass wall made the pavilion too hot to work in, so the workshop had to be relocated. And in the pavilion itself, there was almost no art to see, which is how a 24-year-old artist 2 months out of grad school ends up showing in the Venice Biennale. It was trial by fire, but it was the perfect coonskin training ground, and Bud thrived. The next 4 years were spent in London, where Bud printed for David Hockney, Henry Moore, and other major artists. It was obviously an invaluable experience, but at the same time, he was a hired gun. The choice of artists and the nature of the projects were determined by his employers. And the dream for many Tamarind-trained master printers was always to establish their own print shops where they could pick the artists and direct the projects. Many had gone on to do just that, and there were workshops in Los Angeles, and New York, and Chicago, and San Francisco. But when Bud and Barbara decided to return to the States, they settled on Colorado, not known as a hotspot in the global contemporary art world of the time. They would have no competition for a high-level collaborating lithographic workshop, which was either a red flag or an opportunity. They opted for the latter interpretation and opened up in Boulder in 1976. A lot of artists have come to Sharks Inc. since then. I counted in the Sharkive 145. More significant than that number, however, are how many have chosen to return decade after decade, often from a distance, the first one being Bernard Cohen. Bud is a really nice guy, but you have to have probably a stronger reason than that to travel from London to Boulder to make prints. So it's worth considering what Bud had that the European continent did not. If I had to guess, I would think it came down to a combination of coonskin adaptability and a remarkable attentiveness to the particular. Cohen's work jumps curiously between minimalist and maximalist. His images are often surreptitiously complicated, and they change between the distant view and the close-up view, so that when you look closely at a print like this, you'll find out that the initial impression of fuzziness is an illusion built from jittery near misses. The two affects lead the mind in two different directions. Revealingly, Cohen does not see himself as an abstract artist, since whatever he is making is a concrete fact. Everything I put down is what it is, he has said. If it's cut out of an airplane, it's a cutout of an airplane. So while it may be common practice to talk about prints as if they're simply images, they are in fact objects formed by an accretion of specific molecules doing specific things, which is why it might make sense to take the same shapes and present them in different inks on different papers. But different artists have different needs. And glancing at the editions produced in the 1980s, you can kind of watch Bud seeking out and accommodating what is specific to each person. Cohn was already an experienced printmaker when he met Bud. Laurie Anderson was not, nor was she a painter. What made the medium intriguing for her was its permutational possibilities. Separating a small collection of images, silhouettes of saxophones and palm trees and umbrellas, a photo of Mount Daly, onto separate plates, they could change the color and position of each independently, producing a banquet of variants for use as theatrically scaled projections in her performances. They could also pick one to be printed as an editioned lithograph and repeated as an album cover. It was around this time that Bud began his long working relationship with Red Grooms, who was already famous for his messy, cartoonish constructions that are part painting, part sculpture, part installation. To produce this kind of thing in an edition required expertise not only as a printer, but as a paper engineer. Grooms would come into the studio with a maquette, which would then be dismantled and reversed engineered to figure out how to build it in print. So these are images from the Sharchives showing the color separations required at the top to print the 4-color lithograph in the middle, which would be cut up, folded, and glued with supports based on the guides down at the bottom. 3D printed objects were not new. Pop-ups and paper models had been around for centuries. Renaissance printers had made scientific instruments that could be cut and assembled, as well as gores for globes. In the context of high-end contemporary art, however, this was pretty eccentric, in part because its ostensibly lightweight outcome was the product of such wild amounts of labor. These are the parts for Grooms's wall-mounted relief De Kooning Breaks Through, which comes together as a shirtless Willem de Kooning on a bicycle, balancing one of his woman paintings, the paintings whose legibility caused such distress to abstractionists in the 50s, on his handlebars and tearing through the abstract picture plane, which is in shreds curling around them. It's an elaborate physical joke about what was once a take-no-prisoners moral battle between figuration and abstraction. Clement Greenberg, the doyen of high-minded modernism, the kind that was supposed to make us better people and a better society, wrote a famous essay called Avant-Garde and Kitsch. Kitsch, for Greenberg, was a pop cultural opiate of the people, a nutrition-free, high-caloric junk food for the eye and mind. And though the art world had moved on from the specific avant-garde that Greenberg championed, the idea that serious art's role was that of a corrective to popular taste remained and remains an essential piece of contemporary art thought. Nonetheless, from pop art onward, there had been strategic attempts to disrupt this equation of difficulty or unpleasantness with virtue. And Shark's ink has always seemed to attract artists who wanted to take up that challenge. Some, like Grooms, turned to cartoonish humor. Some, like Don Ed Hardy, made careers in adjacent realms, in Hardy's case as a tattoo artist. The stylistics of tattoos and of printmaking seemed to Bud to be in a natural relationship, so they began working together. This lithograph, recognizable as near relation of the Shark's ink logo, is replete with meaningful iconography from tattoo history, but also personally related to both the artist and the printer. Other artists like Robert Kushner dared to aim for beauty rather than difficulty, and intimacy, this print is small enough to fit in your pocket, rather than intimidation. Kushner argues, contra Western art theory since the Renaissance, that perhaps art doesn't have to justify itself by making us better Christians or better citizens or better wives and mothers, that maybe making us happier is enough. The feminist critique that rose in the 70s provided a theoretical framework for questioning stylistic hierarchies. Why, for example, should a painted composition of interlocking geometric forms be considered important, while one in tile is dismissed as decoration? Why should hard materials like concrete and steel read as more profound than soft materials like fabric and paper? And why should storytelling and pattern, the oldest perhaps of all human art forms, be dismissed as twee or insignificant? Hollis Siegler was a feminist artist who, at a time when much art was pointedly impersonal, made work that was overtly rooted in her personal experience as a gay woman and, for much of her career, a terminally ill one. In goofy theatrical constructions, she abandoned the dignity of naturalism in favor of a kind of lively, juvenile drawing. Intimations of mortality are everywhere, but the terror is rendered in an approachable way. And I think, at least for me, you can kind of see this approachability as characteristic of a lot of what has come out of Shark's ink. Established artists who are interested in making prints have multiple options. They might make etchings in one place, lithographs in another, woodcuts in a third. They might, if they live in New York or Los Angeles, have a commuting relationship with some workshops. Or they might be in the habit of flying someplace exotic to work while staying in a hotel. Or, as at Shark's Ink, they might be put up in the home with the proprietors. Every print shop has a distinct personality. Jim Dine wrote that the austere Paris workshop of the great etcher Aldo Crommelink had the aura of an Opus Dei church, while the Copenhagen workshop of Niels Borch Jensen was, quote, just a shithole. Dine made great prints in both places, but they were markedly different. And this is rarely a question of a printer pushing an artist one way or another. It's more a question of what kind of thoughts and opportunities present themselves in particular situations. So one way to get a handle on the personality of a workshop is to compare what an artist does there versus elsewhere. Painter Yvonne Jacquet is well known for her renderings of cities, mostly New York, often from the air. And she has often used prints to consider the same view at different types of day or in different lights, as in this elegant series of etchings done at AeroPress in New York in the 80s. Although the etchings are representational and autographic, they operate from a kind of cool and considered distance. What the artist was thinking or feeling is not the point of the exercise. Jacquet's first project with Shark's Ink was also a set of views, all of the same scene, this time the southern tip of Manhattan with the Staten Island ferry hoving into view at bottom. But in the Shark prints, the view is framed by a faux airplane window, which has all kinds of consequences. It gives the work as a whole a much less formal, more anecdotal demeanor. It's a bit of a wink and a nudge, as if we are sitting in the artist's lap, looking out the window. I've been talking exclusively about lithography so far, because that's what Bud trained in, and it was the key to the American print renaissance and the ethos of collaboration that came out of it. But part of that ethos is to follow artists where they want to go. So like many workshops, Shark's Ink has expanded its options to accommodate the art that develops there, adding woodcut and screen print to lithography and paper engineering. As a sculptor, John Buck is accustomed to working in wood, and while he's also made lithographs at Shark's, he has been making large-scale woodcuts there since the mid-1980s. Most of these employ a large central figure of some sort or form, surrounded by kind of delicate background chatter. The block is cut like a jigsaw so that the different parts can be inked separately, then reassembled for printing. And because the thin white lines are not carved deeply in the block with a knife, as tends to be typical with woodcut, but rather are just inscribed with a nail or a pen. They are too shallow to be printed by a press. So instead, the prints are made by laying paper over the ink block and rubbing it with things like doorknobs and bones to get in the corners. These two I pulled up just as a useful reminder of an essential truth about printmaking. Though people often think an image is finished when the block or stone is completed, there are still pretty much limitless options for where that image might go. Artist Barbara Takanaga made her first prints with Bud in 1980. But it wasn't until the early 2000s that she really began exploiting the luminosity that lithography is capable of. The luminosity of lithography is for many people the hook. It's what made lithography a serious art medium in France at the turn of the 20th century. So this print doesn't use paper engineering. It doesn't have technical novelties. It doesn't have collage. It doesn't employ woodcut. But it does require sublime skill to make all the different parts come together into a seamless and effective whole. From the initial drawn concept through the subsequent broken out different color plates, each one independent but also connected in a grand scheme that pulls it all together into the final image. It's a different way of thinking about making a picture. Probably no artist these days is more closely associated with Shark Ink than Enrique Chagoya, who has been collaborating with Bud for more than 30 years. Their projects together have included brilliant standalone lithographs, but the most remarkable and singular body of work is that of the codices. Bud had seen Chagoya's hand-painted books before they ever met, books whose format emulated those of pre-Columbian Mesoamerican books of the Aztec and Maya. Like their exemplars, Chagoya's codices, it's a tongue twister, were done as accordion folds, reading from right to left on a mate paper, a kind of papyrus-like surface made from fig bark and coated with white lime. Unlike their exemplars, Chagoya's books availed themselves of the fullness of history, Mayan, Aztec, European Baroque, contemporary Norte Americano, all in raucous conversation. When they did meet, Bud proposed making a lithographic codex, but Chagoya thought it would be impossible to print on the lumpy amate. That skepticism sealed the deal. Bud likes to figure out how to do things that other people tell him are impossible. By the time Chagoya returned to Colorado, Bud had figured out a way to flatten the paper without destroying its character and how to get ink to sit on it properly. Since then, they have made something like a dozen codices, all part of what Chagoya refers to as reverse anthropology, an imagining of a world in which the Spanish conquest failed and Mesoamerican culture survived intact. They're kind of like props for a counterfactual history, and they borrow from everywhere. Aztec and Maya hieroglyphs, Disney characters, Posada woodcuts, European engravings, plastic goo-goo eyes. They are undeniably funny, but they point to a tragic absence. The vast libraries that the Spanish found in the New World, tens of thousands of books, documenting centuries of history, philosophy, literature, and belief systems. And now all that remains are 3 or 4, depending on who's counting, Mayan codices that happen to have been shipped to Europe before the rest were put to the torch. One of the priests involved in the destruction described it as follows. We found a large number of books in these characters, and as they contained nothing in which were not to be seen superstition and lies of the devil, we burned them all. which they regretted to an amazing degree and which caused them much affliction. Humor, among its other virtues, is a way into the unthinkable. Chagoya's newest lithograph picks up on a 16th century cultural collision, the hieroglyphic catechisms that were used to convert native Mesoamericans to Catholicism. And on the left is the new lithograph. On the right is a page from one of these 16th century books. Chagoya's version follows the little pictures in a row format of the surviving texts, but he also provides backwards captions in English and Spanish, tagging the images to contemporary issues from pandemic to climate to global economy, with space for museums of modern art and anthropology. At the very bottom, just above the signature, you can just make out, reading from right to left, "Are you lost? Don't follow me. I am lost too." In this print, as in so much that has come out of Shark's ink, there is a certain kind of sassiness, a refusal to conflate dourness with artistic importance, an openness to enjoyment along multiple axes. This is, after all, a print shop that asked a tattoo artist to design its logo. I first saw the new Chagoya print a couple of weeks ago at the IFPD Air Print Fair in New York, the first time the fair had been live in 3 years. And while there had been virtual fairs during that time, and virtual fairs have their advantages, being back in person was a reminder of just how much is lost in reproduction, how different it is to be bodily present in a space with works of art, not just with screens. You can take in so much with a single sweep of the eye. It beats browsing with a cursor any day. You can also get up close, take time, look slowly. As with any art fair, there's lots of big things that look great from a distance. But as you get closer, you realize that you're not getting any more information from them, that what you saw at first is pretty much all there is to see. The Shark Inks booth has always been a place that rewards getting close enough to see whether the inks sit in or on the paper, close enough to read a text written backwards, close enough to marvel at how something intricate comes together, close enough to go down the rabbit hole. It's all a gift. So thanks, Bud. And that's all I've got.
Thank you so much, Susan. That was a really lovely talk, and it really got me thinking about the geography of American printmaking in a way that I hadn't before, about people kind of moving across the country. And I think people are probably, our audience is probably thinking about how to frame their questions. So I wanted to kind of jump in and ask you that, whether you have any thoughts or response to like how geography kind of plays a role, like in American printmaking, as all of these wonderful lithographers, Bud included, have sort of traveled across the country to set up shops and become these places of kind of gravity for printmaking or for artists to head towards.
I think Bud is pretty unusual in that obviously the art world clusters on the coasts. Art institutions cluster on the coasts. Artists are everywhere. But I think one of the interesting things about Bud is having done this loop from North Dakota to the Southwest to Europe and then coming back to Colorado, he had a kind of familiarity with a breadth of different aspects of the Euro-American art world that I think is pretty rare. And one of the things I noticed going through and the archive and looking at where all these people have come from, who he's worked with, there's definitely a you know, he looked west much more than given the New York, how shall we say, sort of gravitational weight of the art world. You know, people have expectations about it, everything looking in that direction. And it's a lot of Bud's artists are either from, well, from what, let's say west of the Mississippi. Let's put it that way. There's a half a country there. It's 2/3 of a country, whatever. But when you go, it doesn't feel regional. And I guess that's the other piece about it. There are obviously regional shops that specialize in certain areas, and Bud's, you know, remains not that. I don't know if that answered the question.
That did. That's really, that's a nice way of thinking about it. Thank you. And I'm also kind of recalling how when I first started kind of thinking about this Sharkive show, Shark Sync show, I had talked to you about, oh gosh, it was like maybe in 2018, probably at a meeting we were both at.
Mm-hmm.
And I sort of cornered you and asked you about kind of other characteristics about Shark Sync, and you said it, I think when we were talking then, your immediate thought was about the relationship building,
Yeah.
too. And I was thinking about how we see that, you know, so much through these repeat prints that Bud does with different artists, and sort of the kind of lifetime relationships that evolve. But I'm also curious to hear more of your thoughts on that.
Well, first of all, I think it takes a very, very particular type of person to be a good printer, and most of that probably doesn't just have to do with tech skills. Most of it has to do with interpersonal skills and personality type, and a genuine interest in what somebody else is trying to say and figuring out how to help them say it. And all of the really great printers have these long-term relationships, because people find that they can do things working with those printers that they can't do with other printers, they can't do on their own, that simply wouldn't happen otherwise. It's a product of, I mean, you know what it's like when you have a great conversation with somebody, right? And ideas just ping pong back and forth, and all of a sudden you're talking about something that neither one of you had ever thought about before. And I think that's the way these kind of things work. When you listen to artists and printers talk with each other, that's what they talk about.
Yeah, I think we have a question that just popped up about the Shark Sync archive that the CU Art Museum has with these related drawings, and that I think gets to this sort of conversational aspect that you're referring to too, that there's so much back and forth that we see when we can look at the body of work that's, you know, in kind of the archival contribution of the Sharkive, is that you can see the business side of it, but you can also see the kind of process pieces. So we have a number of drawings that are part of the Sharkive, but there are a lot of artists who sort of work directly with on Mylar or with printmaking materials, so that they're not kind of like there's a lot of figuring out that's kind of embedded in the process, and a lot of back and forth and different decisions that are made. So it's really, I think, I'm not sure if it's so much of a contemporary thing, or if we just have this, but now we have these resources to look at it, but it's really astounding to me to see how that process comes through. And even in the records, there's, we have back and forth between maybe Bud and the artist as they're deciding on colors or how different lines or forms are going to go.
Yeah, I think it's one of the great things about these archives being preserved. And I think this has probably always been the case, that people were making those kind of decisions and talking about them and going through paper. But the idea that you preserve these things, I think, is relatively recent. And it does, it's like a window in.
Yeah, it's really, it's really delightful to have access to this. And one of the things that, or some of the objects that came to us from the Sharks, were a series of guest books that they've maintained over the years. So not only do you see, the kind of people who have stayed and worked with Bud and Barbara on site and sort of as kind of resident artists as they're producing these editions, you see them thanking the Sharks, and you get a glimpse of what that personal relationship might be. But then there are also artists who are talking back and forth to each other. I think that that's also the sense too. There's that collaboration between printmaker and artist. But when an artist comes to work with a printmaker like Bud, they're also kind of, they have that eye out towards what somebody else might be doing, or, oh, that's really interesting technique, or great paper, or an interesting color. I want to try that too. So we see that in the guest book where they're joking back and forth, but you can also really see that on the walls too, where people are, kind of relating to artists in this other type of circle or network that's being created.
Yeah, and I also think that what a workshop produces, it provides pleasure and whatever else art provides to its audience, but it also generates ideas. And the 3D printed object thing, obviously Sharks Ink became known for, and I think largely just because they started doing it, and it meant that this was now an option on the table, that people could think in, would Yvonne Jacquet have come up with the idea of doing the little airplane window without other things already having been produced, that then goes into your hopper of things that are possible, ways you can think. So, but yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the hospitality thing, because it's what every artist talks about when they talk about Sharks Ink, is, just Barbara's cooking, and, just the wonderfulness of being in that place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's
It truly is a magical environment that they've kind of created. And being in Lyons, which is feels a little bit kind of out of the little remote, a little quiet. So it's a good place for thinking, I think. And there's sort of, community set up at the studio where people can kind of really focus, it seems. So it's really a treasure. When I give time to see if we have any other questions pop up, I could probably monopolize and ask questions. Well, I do hope that the people who are local can come and see the show, and we do have some resources available online if you are not local, and certainly the Sharchive, which is kind of the ongoing, we're continually building it as Bud is continuing to make prints. That is kind of building out for us. So it's just really, wonderful growing body of printmaking history that we have on view in our galleries, and it's also available online through our collection database. So we hope people are inspired to explore a little bit. And I really would love to thank you again, Susan, for just a really wonderful, wonderful talk. We really, I learned a lot and really appreciated your time and energy towards this topic.
My pleasure.
Great. Thank you so much. And looks like we have one more question. Oh, that's Zoe Shark is popping in to say thank you. So have a wonderful night, everyone. Thank you so much.